the summer of 2018, two men flying drones over a field in Ireland found something that should not have been there. A circle, nearly 500 feet across, buried in ground archaeologists had studied for a century. A professor at University College Dublin said he had never seen anything like it. That same week, something even stranger surfaced 2 miles away. On the evening of July 10, 2018, Anthony Murphy launched his drone from a field beside Newgrange in County Meath, Ireland. He had come to document a drought, nothing more. Ireland was in the grip of the worst dry spell the country had seen since 1976. Rain had not fallen in the Boyne Valley for weeks, and the wheat crop growing around Newgrange was starving for water. Murphy, a writer and photographer who had spent years studying the ancient monuments of this valley, had flown drones over these same fields dozens of times before. He knew the ridges, the ditches, and every stone that broke the surface of the ground. He took off at 8:23 in the evening. His friend Ken Williams arrived a few minutes later with his own drone, and the two men began sweeping their cameras low over the cropland, watching for anything the dying wheat might reveal. It was routine work. Murphy had spent months photographing the known monuments of the valley from the air, cataloging what was already on record. 24 minutes into the flight, at 8:47 that evening, something appeared on Murphy's screen that had never appeared there before. A perfect circle, stamped into the wheat like a shadow beneath the surface, stretching wider than a football pitch. Murphy would later say he shouted the moment he saw it, the kind of shout that comes out before a person has decided to make a sound at all. Williams, flying nearby, heard him and swung his own drone around to look. Neither man needed a geologist to tell them what they were looking at. They had studied this valley long enough to know that nothing like this had ever been recorded in that field, and that whatever was buried beneath the wheat was old, and it was large, and until that evening, it had been completely invisible. Murphy kept the drone in the air until the battery warning forced him down. He landed, changed batteries, and went straight back up. He needed to be certain the shape was real, not a trick of the fading evening light or a fault in the camera. It was still there on the second flight, and the third. Neither of them yet understood exactly how strange it actually was. Newgrange had been famous for centuries before that drone ever left the ground. The Passage Tomb rises from the same valley, a stone mound built more than 5,000 years ago, from an estimated 200,000 tons of material. For most of the 20th century, even the people who studied it did not know its full purpose. That changed in December of 1967, when archaeologist Michael J. O'Kelly, midway through a 13-year excavation, tested a local legend that the tomb had some connection to the sun. He drove up from Cork the day before the winter solstice, let himself into the chamber alone before dawn, and waited in total darkness. Minutes after sunrise, a narrow beam of light entered through a stone aperture above the entrance and crept across the chamber floor, exactly as the old stories had described. Every year since, that same beam of light travels 17 meters down the passage and lights the inner chamber for 17 minutes, an alignment built into the stone more than 5,000 years before O'Kelly stood there to confirm it. The discovery made Newgrange one of the most famous prehistoric sites on Earth. It predates Stonehenge by roughly 1,000 years. It predates the pyramids of Giza by several centuries. Alongside the neighboring tombs of Dowth and Dowth, it forms part of Brú na Bóinne, a UNESCO World Heritage Site and the richest concentration of prehistoric monuments in Europe, its curbstones carved with spirals and lozenges that predate written language on this island by millennia. Archaeologists had walked this ground for more than a century. They had mapped its tombs, cataloged its carvings, and excavated its passages piece by piece. Tour buses had been driving visitors past this exact field for decades. If something enormous was still buried a few hundred meters from Newgrange itself, the reasonable assumption was that someone would have found it by now. The drought, broke that assumption. When soil beneath a crop holds moisture unevenly, buried structures change how the plants above them grow. Wheat rooted in a filled-in ditch stays green longer because the disturbed soil holds water the surrounding ground has already lost. In an ordinary summer, that difference is too subtle to see. In a hard drought, with no rain to even out the difference, it becomes visible from above, in rings and bands, invisible to anyone standing on the ground. Murphy and Williams's circle was enormous. It measured close to 150 meters across, stretching across nearly 900 meters of the natural terraces that run between Newgrange and the River Boyne, and it sat on a field that had been plowed year after year for decades. Whatever built it lay just beneath the modern topsoil, hidden by nothing more than a routine crop of wheat and years of ordinary farming. They sent the images to archaeologists that same night. Within days, Ireland's National Monuments Service confirmed the shape was a genuine buried monument. A henge, the same broad category of circular ceremonial enclosure as Stonehenge, built here from earth and timber rather than standing stone, likely a large gathering place used for seasonal ritual, though archaeologists still debate exactly what took place inside one. The valley already held 6 recorded henges. This was the 7th, giving Brú na Boyne the largest concentration of them found anywhere on Earth. Size alone would have made it significant. What stopped the archaeologists cold when they looked closer was the design. Stephen Davis teaches archaeology at University College Dublin. He has spent decades studying the Boyne Valley, and by 2018, there was very little about its henges that surprised him anymore. Then he examined the images of the new monument and found a detail that did not belong. A standard henge is a simple shape, a single ditch dug in a ring, sometimes doubled for scale, but still unbroken. What Murphy and Williams had found broke that pattern. The ditches were doubled, closely spaced, and cut with regular gaps. Sections of undug ground, breaking the ring into segments, like a dashed line drawn in the earth instead of a solid one. Davis called the segmented double ditch the most extraordinary and unexpected part of the find, and said it was, so far as he was aware, entirely new for a henge-type monument anywhere in Ireland or Britain. Archaeologists already had a name for a related design, the causewayed enclosure, an early Neolithic structure built centuries before the henges of the Boyne Valley, defined by exactly this kind of segmented, gapped ditch. Finding that older structural language borrowed into a much later, late Neolithic henge was not supposed to happen. It meant a building idea archaeologists thought belonged to one era and one specific type of monument had resurfaced in a different architectural tradition hundreds of years later. Davis did not pretend to have an answer for what the causeways were built to do. Asked directly, he said plainly that he did not know. Whoever built this monument, sometime within the same late Neolithic period as its neighbors, though it has never been excavated or precisely dated, did something specific with that ring of ditches that no other henge in the valley, and no other henge on record anywhere in Ireland or Britain, had ever been built to do. Perhaps the gaps controlled how people entered the enclosure, forcing visitors along a fixed path instead of a simple perimeter walk, guiding a crowd through a sequence rather than letting them wander in. Perhaps they marked separate stages of a ceremony that unfolded in stages, one causeway at a time, each gap a threshold a participant crossed only when the ritual called for it. Nobody currently working in Irish archaeology can say for certain. For now, the ditches keep their purpose to themselves. But it was not the only structure the drought had exposed that week. Murphy and Williams flew that same field for weeks after their first discovery, and the henge was not the last thing the drought gave up. A short distance from the new monument, another shape appeared in the crop marks, a tight ring of post holes archaeologists identified as a grooved ware timber circle, a smaller ceremonial structure built from a ring of upright wooden posts, the kind of monument normally associated with the same late Neolithic culture that produced the pottery style giving it its name. Nearby, a second larger outline emerged, a massive rectangular enclosure, later named the Great Rectangular Palisade, its perimeter far larger than any timber palisade previously recorded in the valley. A test excavation was opened on part of it before the year was out, the trench confirming what the drone imagery had only implied. And further east, in fields around the townland of Cairnstown, researchers studying the same aerial photographs identified a fifth, previously unrecorded monument of this general class, sitting on its own, unconnected to the cluster around Newgrange. None of these made the headlines that Dronehenge and the Dowth Hall tomb did. Each one, on its own, would have been treated as a major find in an ordinary year. That July, they were simply part of a longer list, monuments that had never been seen before, surfacing in the same weeks, in the same handful of fields, because the weed above them had finally stopped hiding what was underneath. A later academic survey of the wider landscape, published in the Proceedings of the Prehistoric Society, put the count plainly. At least one, and as many as four, entirely new monuments identified around Newgrange that summer, on top of the henge that had already made international news. The valley had given up an entire layer of its own history at once, in 2018, and even the archaeologists cataloging the results were still working out how many separate structures they were looking at. 2 miles from where Murphy's Circle sat hidden under wheat, an 18th century house called Dowth Hall stood on land owned by an agricultural company named Dronehenge. Renovation work was already underway on the house and its gardens, and because the property sat inside the boundaries of Brú na Bóinne itself, archaeologists monitored every stage of construction in case the ground gave up anything from the valley's ancient past. Archaeologists had already recorded 2 smaller passage tombs on the grounds of Dowth Hall, along with a large curbstone carved with spiral art, found in 2014 in a drainage ditch east of the house. Nobody had connected those pieces into a single conclusion. Nobody had asked why an 18th century mansion happened to sit on a raised rectangular platform of ground. If you are enjoying uncovering these buried monuments with us, take a moment to subscribe, because Ireland's Neolithic landscape is proving to hold considerably more than anyone assumed, and this channel is only getting started on it. Anyway, what the renovation crew found underneath that raised platform stopped the entire project. Beneath the modern lawn, wrapped inside centuries of garden terracing, lay a passage tomb, roughly 5,500 years old, close to 40 meters in diameter, about half the size of Newgrange itself, its curbstones carved with the same spiral art found throughout the valley. Excavators identified at least 6 of those curbstones before the dig was through, and further monitoring across the wider Dowth estate would go on to raise the total number of recorded monuments there from 8 to 13. The house had been standing directly on top of a Neolithic burial mound since the 1760s, its original owners never knowing they were living above a 5,000-year-old grave. Archaeologist Cleodna ní Leonain called it the most significant megalithic find in Ireland in 50 years. Not since the major excavations of the 1960s and 1970s, the same era that gave O'Kelly his solstice discovery a few miles away, had anything of this scale surfaced in the valley, and it had been sitting under a family home the entire time, undisturbed since long before the house itself was built. Ireland's then Minister for Culture, Josepha Madigan, visited the site in person while the curbstones were still being uncovered, calling the find of major importance for understanding the people who had lived in the Boyne Valley 5,500 years earlier. 2 major discoveries in the same valley, within the same week. One found by a drone in a field of dying wheat. One found by a construction crew beneath a house that had stood undisturbed for 250 years. Neither on its own would have been especially unusual for a place as dense with history as Brú na Bóinne. Together, they raised a question that took archaeologists considerably longer to answer. How much more of this valley was still buried, waiting only for the right conditions to reveal itself? The uncomfortable answer is that even the archaeologists working in the valley did not know. That same July, a husband and wife team of archaeologists, Matthew and Geraldine Stout, were leading the first scientific excavation near Newgrange in more than 30 years, funded by a grant from the Royal Irish Academy. Their dig targeted a separate structure entirely, a long earthwork the Stouts believed was a Neolithic cursus, a ceremonial avenue built around the same era as the passage tomb itself, and possibly aligned, like Newgrange, with the movement of the sun. 30 years is a long gap for one of the most studied landscapes in Europe to go without a professional excavation. Brú na Bóinne draws tens of thousands of visitors every year. Its tombs have been photographed, scanned, and written about for generations. And still, the ground the Stouts opened that summer, and the ground Murphy's drone photographed a short walk away, had never been formally investigated at all. Matthew Stout described the discoveries that month as adding an entirely new dimension to the ceremonial activity at Newgrange. His team worked for 4 weeks that July, bottoming out trench after trench, confirming they were dealing with a genuine Neolithic structure rather than a later agricultural feature. Geraldine Stout, who works for Ireland's National Monuments Service, has argued for years that many of the valley's monuments were built for prehistoric pilgrims, part of a wider sacred landscape stretching well beyond the tombs tourists are shown today. Within that same week, a government-commissioned aerial survey flying over Brú na Bóinne identified several additional archaeological features nobody had documented before. A cluster of previously unknown structures surfaced within days of each other, in a landscape professionals had been formally studying since the 19th century. If the experts who had devoted their careers to this valley were still finding structures they had never seen, the obvious question was, how many more remained? And that question stopped being confined to Ireland. The 2018 drought did not stop at the Irish Sea. In the weeks before Murphy's flight, the same dry conditions had already exposed buried forts, castles, and settlement outlines across England and Wales, prompting a wave of new discoveries reported in British newspapers throughout the early summer. Murphy has said that reading those reports was part of what sent him out with his own drone in the first place. If the drought was revealing hidden structures in Britain, he reasoned, it might be doing the same thing at home. He was right, and the pattern did not stop with him. Using satellite imagery captured by Google Earth during that same drought, a separate researcher named Tom Condit began combing through the fields east of the Boyne Valley in County Meath and identified more than 100 previously unrecorded archaeological features that had never appeared on any official record before. One exceptionally dry summer briefly made them visible. Among them was a cluster of ring barrows, small circular burial mounds, grouped closely enough together to suggest an entire prehistoric cemetery nobody had known was there. Condit reported every one of them to Ireland's National Monuments Service. Drone technology had existed for less than a decade at the time Murphy launched his. Ireland had not experienced a drought severe enough to expose buried monuments at this scale since 1976, long before that technology existed at all. The 2018 drought was, in effect, the first real opportunity anyone had ever had to fly a modern camera over a landscape stripped bare by weather instead of excavation. 2 men happened to be holding the cameras when it happened. A third was searching satellite photographs from his desk and found an entire buried cemetery nobody else had noticed. Murphy's circle did not stay visible for long. The wheat was harvested in August of 2018. The field was plowed as it had been every year before it, and the pattern that took 24 minutes to appear on a drone screen disappeared as though it had never existed. It surfaced again briefly the following winter, faint traces showing through a crop of barley. And again, in the years after that, in fields of winter wheat and winter barley, each reappearance governed entirely by rainfall, nobody can schedule, and a farming cycle that has no obligation to archaeology. Researchers have since built three-dimensional digital models of the monument from the handful of aerial images that exist, an attempt to reconstruct in software what the ground itself keeps hiding. Nicknamed Dronehenge by the press that covered it, the monument remains almost entirely unexcavated to this day. Survey work has confirmed its outline and something of its scale, but the ground itself has not been formally opened, and the purpose behind those causeway ditches is, as of this recording, still unresolved. Dowth Hall fared differently. In 2023, the Irish state purchased the estate outright for €11 million, folding it into a new Brú na Bóinne National Park, built specifically to protect what lies beneath it. The passage tomb under the old Georgian house is now one of the most closely guarded sites in the valley, rather than a family's back garden. Brú na Bóinne holds more than 90 recorded monuments across an area smaller than 8 square kilometers, and archaeologists working there now say openly that the surface record understates what actually remains. Every monument found in this valley so far was found by accident. A drought, a drone flight, a renovation crew that happened to be watching closely when the ground finally gave something up. Michael O'Kelly spent 13 years excavating Newgrange and still needed a piece of local folklore to point him toward the one discovery that made the tomb famous. Anthony Murphy spent years photographing this valley from above before a single dry summer showed him a monument nobody had ever recorded. The ground gives up its history only when conditions align, when someone happens to be looking, and when someone is willing to believe a familiar field might still be hiding something nobody has ever seen. Nobody currently knows how many more monuments like this one are still sitting under the fields of County Meath, waiting for the next dry summer, the next drone flight, and the next person who happens to be looking up at exactly the right moment. Thanks for watching. Don't forget to subscribe for more ancient mysteries and impossible discoveries.